All right. So the topic for tonight is moving forward with CI3T, setting up for success. And you will note on the title slide here that this is an Empower Plus session. And so this is basically a special series that we're really excited to host for you all. You work at a school that is currently a part of the research project, either exploring professional learning with enhanced CI3T or a randomized control trial that's happening in 2 states on either coasts of the country. And basically, this is a special session because we are going to be weaving in a bunch of new materials that have been developed over the course of the past few years to make CI3T implementation easier and better in your schools. And so we're really excited to have you all here at our sort of rollout for this very special new series that we're hosting. So as we're getting started, you will notice that your name might be changing in the Zoom windows. Our folks on the call tonight are going to be renaming you with your school initials. If you happen to get a chat from somebody that's from our team asking you what school you work at, they're just trying to make sure that we can get you renamed and check off that you are, in fact, at a school that's part of our research project. So do look out for that. And of course, as we're kind of getting started, we're going to be, of course, talking about your school's CI3T implementation plan. And again, thinking about how this model is going to provide a systematic way to prevent and respond to students' academic, behavioral, and social and emotional needs in a coordinated system that's going to make sure that we have really good data to figure out how our school-wide prevention efforts are going, which students need tier 2 or tier 3 supports, and to make sure that we're addressing all of students' needs in a coordinated fashion and not just thinking about academics or just thinking about behavioral needs, but really putting the pieces together and taking a really integrated approach to supporting students' needs. And particularly as we're coming off of all of the essentially the trauma that's happened with COVID-19, the disruptions to normal school functioning, it is now more than ever so important to take this integrated approach to really think about students' needs from a holistic fashion. And so we would just want to start off by saying thank you all for the work that you're doing, which is the work. And it's so important what you're doing to support students right now during this difficult time. And so thank you. And we hope that tonight's session is going to provide some clarity and guidance and some additional support for you as you're working to put the CI3T plan in place for your school. And also kind of thinking about the supports that are available both to you and colleagues at your school. We are currently at a CI3T Empower session, which is represented by this row in this graphic that you're looking at here. These sessions are available to any faculty and staff at your school as part of the Project Enhance research activities. And so if you are here tonight as a faculty and staff member and say, you know, I've got some colleagues that would benefit hearing some of this content as well, we encourage you to invite them and to attend these sessions as well. And just to give you some additional context, you may be or a CI3T leadership team member who's also attending the CI3T implementation support series, or you might be at a school that has a CI3 team that's attending those sessions. The point of those sessions is to give your school leaders guidance as they're working through the school year to collect data and use those data to inform what's happening in terms of CI3T at your school. So those two experiences are sort of the foundational elements of professional learning that you have available via the CI3T ongoing data-informed professional learning efforts. So that's just to kind of give you a sense of like where we're at in terms of your school's professional learning journey for this school year. And as I mentioned before, we are really excited about these new professional learning materials that we'll be showing you tonight. We will encourage you to sign into the Project Enhance tab of ci3t.org. And one of my colleagues will put in the chat both the URL that you can click on to get to this tab, as well as a password you can use to access all the materials that live behind the password protected piece of that website. And basically, we ask that you keep this password private to yourself or to colleagues that work at your school, because at this time, these resources are only available to school personnel that are working in schools as part of this research project. So as you're looking at materials that you see here tonight and you're thinking, wow, I'd want to share this with one of my colleagues, know that you can do that. And you are welcome to share this password, but just please keep that within your school. That's really important to make sure that we can honor the work or honor the trust of our funder who's giving us support and resources necessary to make these professional learning materials. As well as on this website, you can also download the actual PowerPoint presentation that we'll be showing you tonight. So if you want the supplementary materials for what we'll be looking at tonight, just know that you can go to that Project Enhance page, scroll all the way to the very bottom of the page. You'll find a nice blue accordion set that's called 2022-2023 Project Enhance Empower Resources. If you were to click on session 1 right here, you'd find a downloadable PowerPoint agenda and some other materials that we'll be talking about tonight. So you're welcome to download those as you like. So to get us kicked off, I'll give you just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about this evening. We are going to welcome you and just kind of give you a quick little tidbit before we get started. Then we're going to jump into an overview of the CI3T model itself, which I believe Kathleen will be here to present that part. We'll talk a little bit about some things that you might be expecting to do during this very beginning part of the school year, about some things that you might be doing with your CI3T leadership team from a school organizational perspective to kick this school year off and and having access to professional development opportunities, as well as things that you might be doing specifically for your students to roll out the CI3T plan to them. We'll then talk about some of the big ideas of Tier 1 with a really big emphasis on covering like what does the academic experience look like for students at Tier 1? What are some of the major aspects of your behavioral component for Tier 1? And then what is the social and emotional well-being component looking like as well? We'll be wrapping it up then with something that's called procedures for teaching, reinforcing, and monitoring. Basically, these are 3 areas that we're going to be focusing on how you can continue to refine and improve the way that we're supporting students' needs by providing instruction and reinforcing both behaviors related to behavioral success and academic success as well. And one of the things we're really excited to talk about tonight is your school's universal reinforcement system, which you might think about as a paper ticket. And we're going to actually do some training tonight to emphasize some of the ideal ways to use that ticket to best support your students. And we'll close with just a quick preview of what's coming up next in our Project Empower professional learning series. So as we're getting started tonight, we do encourage you, if you've got your school's CI3T implementation manual, that would be an excellent thing to pull up to have handy tonight. Because as we're talking about various pieces of CI3T, it's nice for you to be able to cross-reference what your school actually is doing in respect to academic, behavioral, and social and emotional well-being, curricula, and procedures. And so we'll kind of show you some of the places you might look in your manual to get some of that information. And of course, as we're moving through this, we'll be continually showing you some modules, and we'll encourage you to pull up this Project Enhance tab on the website to maybe open those up and start doing some very preliminary exploring for what all resources you've got available to you. And to set the stage for sort of like what's the big why behind your school's CI3T plan, it's important to know that just over the past 25 or 30 years, as people have been looking at student behavior in schools, we've basically come to the realization that there are a lot of students that have behavioral needs who are never going to qualify for special education because those needs aren't such that they really need or would qualify for any kind of special services. That said, those students are in general education and often struggling in academic skills, as well as those behavioral and social and emotional skills. And so what we know is that we can't just try to address students' behavioral need, because then we're neglecting to address their academic need. And if we're only doing academic instruction, then we're missing opportunities to support students in gaining behavioral skills as well. And so this work is focused and laser focused on making sure that we're able to detect students who have the major behavioral disorders in childhood, which are internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors. And by locating those kids, figuring out what we can do to prevent those challenges from becoming greater. And when those challenges are becoming an issue for them, then figuring out what interventions we can provide to those students to make their school experience better. And by doing that, making their lives better in the long run as well. And so all of this work is focused on a shift to a systems perspective, because we know that you can't just do this class by class or student by student. You want to build capacity for your entire school to be having a really focused structure to make this work sustain over time. And so the systems level perspective is super important. And this work has been going on, as I mentioned, for the past 25 or 30 years. CI3T was first implemented in California in 1997. And
when I was 10.
There she is. Welcome, Kathleen. So over the course of those years, we've had an enormous and really talented research team focused on supporting schools across the country and implementing CI3T. So we've had schools in California, Arizona, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kansas, Missouri, Vermont, and Washington, Hawaii, Iowa. So all over the country, there are schools that are dedicated and focused on this work. And very recently, our Project Enhance research grant has been focusing on how to take the work that schools are doing and enhancing it and making their efforts to implement CI3T easier and more effective. And so we're excited to share what that's going to look like tonight. As I've mentioned, Project Enhance is a multi-year project emphasizing the development of professional learning materials. So we've collected a lot of data to figure out what kinds of resources people need and figured out what people like and don't like. And all of those materials are now being tested as part of the 2 studies that I mentioned before that your schools are participating in. So we're super excited to share those with you. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen for just a moment to do a quick deep dive on CI3T.
Great. And as Mark said, it's just such a gift. I'm just so happy to see like good friends. It feels like a homecoming. So I appreciate the time. And I want to thank Mark and Rebecca, who's not yet here tonight. It was actually their idea to host this special enhanced session for people that are specifically in this. So we are beyond excited to kind of take a peek back and let you take a look at those resources. If you were able to find those resources by logging in, could you put a yes in the chat? And if you haven't found them yet, just scream man down in the chat and we will help you. Leanne, I love your smile. Great. Terrific. And I would encourage you to hang on to this username and password. And we just, as Mark mentioned, just ask this very few times when we ask you not to share. This is one of them. But you are welcome to use it with anybody in your specific school. So feel free to share these resources. You can share them with others. There's going to be things you might want to download as a family. And just to kind of take a moment to set the stage as to like the clarity of behind what has been built. We just want to take just a couple minutes to do that. And I know some of you opportunity to start building the CI3T blueprint for your school in 2013 school year, 2013, 2014, the beginning of Kansas time as well. So it's just super exciting to see this come together. And just to set the stage before you get a chance to take a peek at some of these implementation materials as we think about where you are this year, just a reminder that the base of this is tier 1 for everybody. And a lot of common questions came up in the early years about asking the question of, do kids that are receiving special education services, do they also get tier 1? And the answer is 100%. So when you're looking at tier 1, that is truly for every single student in your building. And as part of that, we want to make sure that we are addressing some of our goals and objectives related to equity by ensuring that we are leveling the playing field for every single student in your building. So that tier 1 experience for academics, getting instruction and what's expected behavior that, be respectful, be responsible, give best effort, making sure that every child gets access to your validated resource that you're using for social and emotional well-being. And I know some of you are in districts right now where you're in the process of looking at doing a new adoption for next year, and that's great, but these kids are there this year. So whatever your resource is, we're going to use it because we want to make sure that we're addressing kids' well-being. And even as awesome as everything is that you're doing, there's 100% likelihood there's going to be some children in your building that need more than tier 1 has to offer. So when we think about tier 2, this doesn't mean it's a bad child or a bad teacher or a bad school. We're going to have this expectation that some kids are going to need more than tier 1 has to offer. And part of what we want to figure out here is the types of challenges that they're having. Is it a can't do? Is it a trouble doing? Is it a won't do thing? And that matters because as we start to think about how best to support kids, a tier 2 support might be literally providing explicit instruction in like how to crack the code for reading or how to develop new social skills or how to practice those newly learned skills in other places if it's an acquisition issue. And for many kids, it's not that. They know what to do. They're not motivated yet to doing it. And I remember reading an article years ago by Frank Gresham, and he estimated that about 80% of the social skills challenges at tier 2 that required tier 2 to support were related to issues in motivation. And the good news is you've already got a universal reinforcement system in your school. So we want to clear up that tier 2 is expected. And there are no tier 2 students. There are children that have tier 2 needs, and they're fluid. I might, as you know, have tier 3 needs for social skills. I might have tier 2 needs for study skills, but it's going to vary, and we need to be prepared for that. And this is not the pre-referral intervention process. So this is not GEI. So this is the point in your manual, is to make sure that you can scroll down, look to see what are the resources available at tier 2 for students. And we want to make sure that they have access to them. Similarly, we want to think about tier 3 supports. So for reserved for kids with the most intensive intervention needs. And some of the stuff that we're going to show you tonight on this website, we'll be talking about in subsequent professional learning experiences, but we want to make sure that we know that there's a plan for kids that have multiple needs, and ideally want to address this in an integrated fashion. We also want to clear up the misunderstanding. Tier 3 is not special education. Kids that are receiving special education supports are accessing all of these different levels of prevention. So tier 1 for all, tier 2 for some, tier 3 for a few. And as we do that, we know that we're also in CI3T committed to the 3 big core features, because it used to be that people had these ideas. I'm going to do have this team that's going to look at academic data. I'm going to have another team that's going to look at office discipline referral data. And then there often was a mental health team that didn't often have data. And in a CI3T model, we're putting all this together so that when you think about those 3 big building blocks of meeting kids' multiple needs, we want to do that in an integrated way. And most people went into teaching thinking okay, I'm going into this with, I'm going to focus on academics. And I remember back in the day when I was on faculty and on the West Coast. And I remember somebody saying to me, oh, I'm not going to need CI3T because I'm going to be a gen ed teacher. So I'm not going to have any real behavior problems for kids that don't have, the social skills that they need. And I just remember thinking, oh, honey, the kids don't come in in little tiny chunks. They come in as a whole kid. So we need to be prepared for the whole thing. And in each of your buildings, you have built your positive behavior intervention framework. And that is the heart and soul of CI3T. PBS is in the middle. And you might recall that years ago, your school did a survey called the School-Wide Survey for, dang it, I do this every time. School-wide, David, unmute. Tell me what it is.
School-wide expectation survey.
Survey for specific settings. I do this every time. I panic because this is David's main line of inquiry.
You've been so good for so long lately.
I know, and I just blew it. So yes, thank you, David. And the point of having every adult in your building complete that survey was so that you could get input from every adult in your building that's going to be giving feedback to kids. So that your expectation matrix was built on the value and the culture of the community in your building. And so you have an opportunity to practice and teach that to kids, and they get to receive acknowledgments. And similarly, you also have a clear path forward for how you're going to address social and emotional well-being. So when you look at your plans, and you don't have to love your curriculum, but out of respect for the fact that we're all on the same page for wanting to make sure that kids are getting access to the skills that they need to not only negotiate relationships better with the adults and their peers, but also to recognize how they themselves are doing, to be aware of their own feelings and to learn how to self-regulate. We're committed to that. And so when you think about the entirety of the base experience that's in your CI3T manual, it comes to life in the pages there. In these pages, you've clarified roles and responsibilities. You have clarified what's available, what students need to know, faculty and staff need to know, what families need to know, what administrators are accountable for, and you've come up with plans in your school about how to teach that, how to acknowledge it. And if you have access to your CI3T manual right now, I'm going to encourage you in just a couple minutes to be ready to pull it up. Years ago, it was a blank document, it was a blueprint, and each of you have participated in getting input as a CI3T leadership team. You had those feedback loops during the building process, and every single year you go in and you ask for input from your faculty and staff to say, what do you think about the goals of what we're trying to accomplish? Are you comfortable with these procedures? Do you think this is working? What are you teaching? How's reinforcement going? So in the pages of your blueprint, oftentimes, in the vast majority of your schools, you've listed these low intensity supports, and I've watched amazing things happen in your building. So I'm think one time in Auburn Washburn going, and looking in one of their district-wide days, and they have these little 10-minute, you could pull up and do a 10-minute professional learning on each of those strategies. in Lawrence and in Topeka, I've seen them do, 1 hour breakout sessions on those different topics. So there's a whole venue of support. And part of what we prepared for you in Project Enhance is we've been listening and learning from you to say, we need these in a whole bunch of different ways, not just stand and deliver things, but we need access to these things in an on-demand fashion so that if I have 10 minutes or 20 minutes, I have a way to jump in and learn it. But when we think about those specific strategies, those are important because that's how we're going to maximize engagement, minimize disruption. Also, equally important on the behavioral end of things is not just teaching expected behaviors and practicing them, but also having a plan for non-responsiveness, because I'm also 100% sure that there will be some kids in your building that have some challenging behaviors. And we want that path forward for kids to be respectful so that you're showing empathy, you're keeping instruction moving forward. You are recognizing other kids who are meeting expectations, reminding or reteaching this kid who needs to get back on track. And then second, that they do, we recognize them and acknowledge them and move forward. So you can be rigorous and still be respectful in responding to challenging behaviors. And there's clarity in your plans about the timing and the what and the how and the practice of what's going to get taught at tier 1 for social emotional well-being. And we all know, like I'm looking at experts in this room, it's not just teaching those skills, it's helping people to thread the needle through instruction so that it all gets woven together in the fabric of daily interactions and lesson plans with kids. And when we talk about teaching at tier 1, this is what we're talking about. Teaching the academics, using positive behavior intervention supports, not only teaching those social skills, but weaving them into daily practice opportunities for kids. And just like we acknowledge kids for using those expected behaviors, we need to be intentional about recognizing the adults in the building. And I will say I'm thankful for this model because we've learned right here from some of your schools that we know that teachers, after 2 years of implementing CI3T, reported lower burnout rates than the national average and a higher sense of efficacy, not in every domain, but in several. And right now, that probably has never been more important. We can't ask teachers to do things that are going to burn them out. And in your schools, as part of this project, we will be re-looking at that. So you yourself will have an opportunity to weigh in this year, 2 times this year, 2 times next year to say how your well-being is doing. So we can see, is it still being a supportive structure as we start to navigate through, I don't want to call it post-pandemic, but as we navigate through the pandemic, hopefully over soon. And of course, throughout this entire model, data are the key. We want to make sure that we are making accurate decisions about what to do at tier 1, how to support kids that need more than tier 1 has to offer, and how to empower the adults in the building to get the supports that they need. So as you are right now, I hope, starting to look at these resources that are on that website, we've had the opportunity to learn from you from the last 3 years to find out like what's been useful, what did people need more of. And so we are paving a path now with you with new professional learning materials. And the first time you go to this site, and if you're there right now for the first time, click where it says click here on the website. And in that, you're going to enter just a little bit of information one time. It's to give like an informational letter, learn a little bit about you. And then thereafter, each time you just put your district assigned email. And I think Mark probably already mentioned this, but in case you don't recall it, we don't want to give it a second because it doesn't pop up instantly. So don't enter things twice, just give it a couple minutes and it'll come up. So as we're thinking about this opportunity, when you get onto this page, this is some of what you're going to see. And these have now been organized into buckets of resources. So here's a whole series of modules that's supporting people that are in CI3T leadership roles, principals, superintendents, vice principals, deans of students. There's another block of materials about how to embed this integrated approach to tier 1 support. And there's also a whole bank, and these are currently being developed. Behavior-specific praise and instructional choice are there for you now about strategies that you can use. And in these pages, you're going to see these ebooks as well as these interactive resources to use. And there's pockets of information about how to support tier 2 and tier 3. And one thing that almost everybody that's logged into this call tonight, and you guys are a tiny but mighty group, is people have said through the years, like, we need resources to explain things like what is the difference between like positive reinforcement and bribery. And so we kept lists of input from you and looked through back data, and we learned that people needed to know things like how does consequences work in CI3T models? What's the role of the universal system? So that I think about these things as like building your base. So within this scope, you've got all those aspects of your plans. And now what we want to do is just think a little bit about how you did roll out your plan this past year. And some of the things that we'd like you, when we open up for this first conversation in this small group, is we want to think about like, how have you been communicating what those roles and responsibilities are for all the key stakeholders in your building? Like, how have you communicated to kids what's expected? How have you communicated with faculty and staff? Like, do you know as faculty and staff members what's expected in each of those three big domains and what has been messaged out with families? And that's often a thing that doesn't happen at the same time at the beginning of the year, but as you're thinking about planning back to school nights, doing newsletters, things like that, how are you messaging out all the wonderful things that you're doing to help to ensure that you are meeting your kids' multiple needs? And in your plan, you might recall that you do have those plans in place, like how you're going to teach your teachers, how you're going to teach your students, how you're going to teach your community members. And so some of the things that you might look back and think like on this year when you opened, and it's been an unusual last couple of years for school for sure, but do you still have signage up that reflects current expectations? Many of you did a beautiful job of pivoting to using these exact structures for teaching things like masking up and washing your hands and maintaining social distances. Is the signage that you're currently having still the functional teaching tool that you need? And as you look at these low intensity supports, do you have thoughts about how you yourself want to use those in your day-to-day interactions with kids and in with faculty members? Have you thought about the tools that you have for responding to challenging behaviors? And now that we are coming back to real life and day-to-day functioning, is there a plan for how that tier 1 social skills is being rolled out? Some people have been sharing with us that they've been doing that more so now than ever because they're recognizing the need of making sure to have those building blocks. So in your conversations, you might just take a moment to think about those reflections. What have you seen up in your classroom, in the classrooms that you're in? What have you done to start the year off with excitement? What was your initial communications with families? And maybe it hasn't happened yet. Maybe you're in the process of getting ready to share out those beginning of the year letters to families. But what did it look like when you welcome kids back into your building this year? How did you clarify for many of the kids in some of the elementary schools? You know, that you've got 3 grade levels of kids who have never had a totally normal school experience. In some ways, it's almost like opening a brand new school. So I'd like you to think a little bit about the successes that you've had. And as you're starting to think about, oh my gosh, maybe I haven't totally communicated with families in the way I have. One of the things you might think about is not only that letter that your school likely has crafted or will soon, you might also think about the idea of just something simple, like either an electronic or a physical brochure that you can send to explain the big ideas. Some people are also making a wonderful digital footprint on their school's website. So, and teachers are doing it on their personal pages as well for the school to say, here's how we're supporting your child's multiple needs. Like, here are the lessons that are being taught, like on empathy, self-awareness. Here are the ways that we're making sure that we are addressing learning loss by making sure that we're protecting really positive and productive time by us as teachers, making sure that we're using those low intensity supports to maximize engagement and limit disruption. So if you would, if you're willing to play the school game, if you want to go ahead and open up the chat, would you be willing to go ahead and don't hit send on it yet in terms of posting it, but would you please go ahead and think about these questions? And the most basic of which is, do you know where your CI3T implementation manual is? And just in your mind, think about, do you know where it's located? Maybe you've used it this year, maybe not yet. What have you seen done really well in your building? And I want you to think about like either a practice or something that you've done well with other kids or with other adults in your building. And what are you looking forward to in the coming year? Will you pick one of those questions to answer? And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds just to type it up, but don't hit send yet. We'll just release these all at one time so you can read them. So let's take about 30 seconds to share a success or answer to one of those questions. As we're thinking about where you are at right now, one of the things we'd like to talk about is what it has looked like in terms of roles and responsibilities for various people at tier 1 in those 3 big areas. And if you are able to access your plan right now, would you go ahead and open that up and scroll down in your plan until you see those 3 big columns for faculty and staff. So it'll say academics, behavior, and it'll say social skills, and it'll say responsibilities. So let's take a second to think about what's in there right now as you're thinking about communicating out, like knowing what your roles and responsibilities, and thinking right now, give yourself permission to not be perfect. So when we start to think about the things that are in here, please think about the great things that you've done and maybe one thing that you want to shift as you move forward, but no beating up of yourself while we're looking at this. But one of the things that we're going to encourage you to think about is, is there clarity still in your plan as to what's going to get accomplished? Some of you might have like English and language arts blocks that are going to be 90 minutes. Some of you have the name program for how that's going to be done, or the resource. Many of you have information on those low intensity strategies that you're being encouraged to use as you interact with kids in instructional and non-instructional area. And you might recall in the olden days, you had this page on the professional learning tab where you could scroll down and you saw those navy blue bars and you can open it up. And now I'm really excited that you're going to get a chance to see in just a couple of minutes a little bit about those are now becoming these tricked out resources. And there's 2. There's an ebook that you can scroll through electronically. And then we also made these things like an interactive resource, which is like a really souped up PowerPoint. And it actually, you can push play, it'll read it to you. And initially, when we started doing this work with your CI3T leadership teams, we said, what do you think people would want? The ebook, or do you think they'd want this interactive resource? And the answer was both. And people said, they often like to listen to the resource first and watch it, but they wanted something static to be able to go back and refer back to. So we got permission and immediately doubled our work scope. So as you're starting to think about these things tonight, when we get a chance to go into our first little conversation about it, I'm going to encourage you to go check out behavior specific praise and also go look at instructional choices. And we have a whole session in 2 more times where we're going to walk through how to use those if you decided to do it. So like if Leanne was going to go lead a professional learning, or Janelle was going to, or they just simply wanted to go do it with their grade level teams, everything you're going to need is going to be right there. So in terms of that academic piece, when we open it up for conversation in a couple of minutes, I'd love to know if anybody is using those low intensity supports right now in your instruction, or what success are you experiencing at tier 1 with your academics for this year in terms of that. The second big block, I'd love for you to scroll down and look at your plan, is check in there to see what was your initial plan for people's roles and responsibilities for kind of rolling out the teaching of expected behaviors. And I would be asking the questions of, do I have a poster in my classroom? Do I have the big one that has all the settings in it? Do I have the one that's specific to classroom? Have you seen that signage in your cafeterias and your hallways and other non-instructional areas? So in other words, are kids familiar with what's expected when they're in your class? And when I was teaching using this, I'd like to have them right by my, whiteboard at the front. And I also really appreciated having a second one by the door, so that when I was getting ready to take kids out to go out to recess or go to lunch, I could just quickly say, hey, who can remind me of one way we're going to show some respect for in the hallway? And it really becomes that teaching tool. So as you think about those expectations, we also want to remind you that in your plan, you've got that path for moving forward as far as what to do when the wheels fall off the bus. And one of the modules that we have ready for you right now, if you're interested in it, is there's a whole module about each one of those steps. Breaks it all down as to what does that mean to show empathy? Like, what is it? Why do you do it? And how do you do it? And so you can find in the pages of that ebook and that interactive resource that they'll be there. Also in your reactive plan, you've got clarity from your districts as to what gets managed in your classroom and what's going to get managed in the office. And that's really important because as Leanne was just mentioning, and I think as Teresa posted as well, there are many new staff in your building. So part of it is reteaching all the expected roles and responsibilities to everybody new in your building. And one thing that I think you're going to like is that we even have a module on how to onboard new people into your CI3T system so that they can learn what this is. And that's one of the leadership modules that it's at the very top. So that might be of use to you. Now, that one I was just mentioning about, that resource for being able to respond to challenging behaviors, ideally, this is going to be a tier 1 practice that you're going to teach every single solitary adult in your building. So the steps being these that we just talked through: showing empathy, maintaining the flow of instruction, acknowledging other kids that are meeting those expectations, redirecting and reteaching those expected behaviors for that kid who's struggling to remember, and then giving them just a second to get back on track. So not hovering, but just giving them a little bit of space. And as soon as they do it, then Heather would come over to me and say, "Great job, Kathleen, you are back on track. Glad to see you." And then she could acknowledge me. So if that sounds appealing to you, you might choose to check out this 6-step process for responding to challenging behaviors. And in the pages, this is where you're going to see those 2 things that I was telling you about. So you're going to have this ebook that is literally like if you've read a book, like a digital book, you're turning the pages, and that interactive resource. And these are parallel content. So it is the same information in 2 different formats. Because one of the things in the surveys that we got to do of the faculty and staff in each of your buildings in the very first year of this project, which was 3 years ago, people said very clearly they do not want to have only this kind of format where you go and you listen to somebody. They wanted on-demand resources for their time. And when you open up these pages, there's also things like 1-page infographics, short videos, like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes. So you're going to find a bunch of these different resources, and we're excited to hear from you about what you think. And these are going to help you to learn these steps and these processes. So for each of those 6 steps that we just talked through, it's going to be, what do I do? Tell me exactly what that means to show empathy. In those pages, you'll also see the why, like, why is that my first response rather than having the sharp, no. And then it also gives you this whole thing on what to avoid, the pitfalls. So just to be clear, this is some of the content that you're going to see when you're thinking about showing empathy. And by acknowledging, like by indicating to somebody, like when somebody comes in hot, like from recess or even off the bus, some kids don't even come into school calm. When you see them coming in like that, this is just a moment for you to recognize that, I can see you're having a hard time right now. So it's letting that child know that you recognize they're having a hard time and that you're communicating care and that you want to help them to get back on track. And so oftentimes that means doing this in a private manner, connecting with them privately. And you're thinking about sometimes even putting kids into a short little activity that removes them from the center of attention, gives them a moment to calm down. But it's basically like meeting kids where they are. And I think we've all had moments like that as adults. And I certainly have had those moments where, especially as the world started opening up. And I remember sometimes I felt like, God, I got to call in fat. I can't show up because I can't even find any pants with a button that fit. And then I can't wear my pandemic pants for the 4th day in a row at work. So, and when I come in, I'm a little bit late and a little bit ragged and, looking like this, I need somebody to show a little bit of empathy. It's like, oh my gosh, it looks like it must have been one of those mornings. And that is so much nicer than saying, why are you late? And it's like, because I couldn't button my pants, and it led to a whole thing in my closet. Kids have the same thing. They're human. So we want to consider the timing and the approach, and basically letting your body communicate, not this, but like this, that, I'm sorry, this is tough, and I want to help you to get back on track. And oftentimes, and you'll see in little video interactions in there, even that idea about getting low when you're talking to the child, not so close that they can reach out and touch you, but get low so that they're not feeling like you're towering over them while you're trying to communicate care. And so there's really practical advice. And I want to show you these things about like keeping it brief, keeping it specific, and offering solutions-based support. And so in the pages of these modules that you're going to have time to take a peek at, we want to make sure that we're also giving really practical advice of, modeling the behavior you want to see more of. And I really do appreciate that. I love it when you're in a classroom and you've been indicating to kids like what you expect from them, and you're showing them the same. You're giving them that grace, and you're making a really clear example about what that looks like. And by doing this and avoiding those power struggles, we are building relationships with kids, which is one of the biggest protective factors for them and for the classroom environment. Because it's awful for a teacher. And I know we've all experienced this where we haven't made the exact right call at the exact right time and things escalate. It leads to everybody feeling unsafe. It's embarrassing as a teacher. You feel like you've lost control. Sometimes it communicates to other kids that it doesn't feel as safe as it needs to be. And so that's why there's even things to avoid. It's kind of like what not to wear for clothing, but with behavioral support. So, and if you haven't seen that show yet, I did get nominated by 2 students several years ago for that show. Anyway, I didn't make it, but I would have shared it with you if I had. but we want to make sure that like there's no communication publicly that is harsh or unkind, because that is not constructive for students. And we don't want to come across as overbearing, but instead we just want to be short, brief, clear, and helping that student to get back on track. And while we won't take the time to go through each of those steps right now, in those resources, you're going to find those. And I would encourage us to be thinking about really placing the value right now on teaching expected behavior and doing that with intensity, like teaching those lessons. And Mark will show you some more about that in just a couple of minutes. But in addition to that, I would also be preparing your faculty and staff and yourself personally to say, like, I also need to get ready so that I am ready when problems show up. So I would say do these both in this first semester of the school year, but I would start with teaching expected behaviors, and I'd start prepping myself for when the honeymoon of being back is not quite in the forefront. So in their next conversation, I'm going to encourage you to think about, what have you been doing? Have you been teaching the expected behaviors? Did that happen this year in terms of teaching kids what it means to be respectful and responsible and safe in classrooms, in hallways, in the cafeteria, during arrival and dismissals? And lastly, that third building block that we want to think about is thinking all about that social and emotional well-being piece. And some of you have a validated resource that you love, and some of you have a validated resource that you're excited to see go and get another opportunity for the following year. And I respect both those positions. And I want us to remember that for this year, we're all on the same page, that we want to meet the needs of the kids that are here today. And I can't imagine any of us saying to a kid, this is not my first choice for a curriculum, so we're just not going to use this because next year we're starting something new. These kids are with you for this entire year. And we want them to have these skill sets. And even if this isn't our most favorite way to teach it right now, for the time being, we are committed to the goal of empowering these kids with these very practical skills that they can use to negotiate the day-to-day. So I'm looking at Julie nodding, and I appreciate that, because we are committed to meeting this goal of meeting kids' multiple needs. So what you got is what you got. And so we want to know, do you know where your instructional schedule is? Has that been shared out with you? Do you know the timing of when things are supposed to happen? And remember that the idea behind that is that all kids in your building are getting that content instruction at about the same time. And what a gift. So that way, when kids are being taught how to show empathy towards others, you're modeling that when they're having trouble. You might weave it into a lesson to say, you know, when this book that we're reading about, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, I want you to look to see which characters you think just did a great job of showing empathy to others and which ones have room to grow. And for your upper elementaries kids, you might have them write a letter of advice to somebody to say, I think you did a really good job in this place, but I think you have room to grow over here. And so it's a way where you can show them and give them applied practice in the context in which you teach. So as you think about this time, and we're going to stay together in this whole group, is that what the plan is still going to be, Mark? Okay, great. I'd like you to think about what's happening in terms of those social skills lessons, where your strengths are and where your areas of refinement are. And we will stop the recording during this time so that you can feel comfortable having a totally transparent conversation. So as you're thinking about this overall component too of all three of those, I want to remind you that we also have this emphasis on integrated lesson planning. And we are not suggesting you ask teachers to like fill out these lesson plans every time that they teach, but I am asking you to think about sharing this idea just conceptually so that when they're teaching any lesson, just like what I was talking to you about, like an opportunity to, like if I'm doing a thing on a small group, a lesson plan on, you know, the causes of the Civil War, and I might put them into small groups. Before I do that, I'm going to explain to them what they're supposed to do in terms of identifying those causes. I'm going to also remind them this could be a great opportunity to practice active listening skills, which is one of the lessons we talked about a couple weeks ago. So what is that going to look like? Or it might be, it's going to give me a good opportunity to make my needs known, or advocate for my own position, but in a way that doesn't offend somebody else. Because you can advocate for yourself without discounting somebody else's idea. And then I'm going to do things like also remind kids of the expected behavior. I'm going to pre-correct, like use that strategy to say, In our expectation matrix, one of the ways we're going to show responsibilities when we're working in small group is to do the following things. The other piece of this intentionality with teaching is we want teachers to know that those strategies can be woven into different stages of the lesson. So I might start that lesson with a journal prompt, and I might have 2 journal prompts. And when they come in back from a break, I might say there's 2 journal prompts on the board, and I'd like you to pick one. And I'd like you to spend about 3 minutes sharing out that. So I'm leaving an instructional choice during a starting activity. And then I might do something else, like I might do higher rates of behavior specific praise when I start to go into independent seat work, because I know that's been hard for my kids to stay focused. I might do active supervision when I'm putting them into guided practice with a partner. So just the idea that these things get married together. It's not like I teach the social skill, cross it off my list, and go on to the next thing. I'm actually using those social skills in my instruction. And when we were mentioning at the beginning about the new modules that have been created for you, if that makes sense to you, it's something that's appealing, then you might want to write down the Empower session for Empower Session 3, because on that night, we're going to go through just very simply two of these low intensity supports. We're going to do one on behavior specific praise, which is kind of the linchpin for all behavior change. And I know David and Paloma, who are here, just finished up a wonderful literature review not too long ago on instructional choice. And they just got another one accepted for publication today on second steps, that whole curriculum. So I know we're learning great things from them. But in these different resources that you have, you might think to yourself, I want to set a personal target of reviewing one of these or brushing up on how I might do even better in the use of those low intensity strategies.
All right, so we're going to jump into the next section. We talked a lot about roles and responsibilities and breaking down the academic, behavioral, and social emotional piece of your CI3T plan. The next thing we're going to talk about is thinking about how do we teach and support everybody in being successful in using those strategies, and how do we actually reinforce the behavior of our colleagues, our students, and even the families and community members that we're trying to support as well, to make sure that we're honoring the work that's happening as part of your CI3T work. And then we'll close out with a quick conversation about data, which is one of my favorite parts because, you know, who doesn't love really good and useful data as well. So jumping into the first block here is going to be about procedures for teaching. Maybe, if it'll go. There we go. So in your CI3T plan, still in the tier 1 primary prevention part of your plan, if you scroll down far enough, you're going to find a series of tables that will break down procedures for teaching for faculty and staff, students and parents and community members. So the label for each of those boxes is the stakeholder who is going to be receiving instruction about the CI3T plan or how to be successful in the context of CI3T. And on this slide, you can see some pictures of really common ways that school leadership teams will actually support their faculty and staff, their colleagues, in learning about their CI3T plan. So for example, sharing actual physical materials, your CI3T implementation manual, the signage and posters that are going up in classrooms, the actual physical tickets. And just by giving those materials to people, we're giving them the physical information and materials that they need to actually implement. Also, just making sure that we're, I was about to say the exact same thing all over again. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go to the next slide. For procedures for teaching faculty and staff, you will find a bunch of different examples in your CI3T plan. And it would be a great idea for you to pull that up and actually see what shows up in your procedures for teaching faculty and staff. Really common things that would show up are things like I mentioned before, giving materials like posters, lesson plans, tickets, and then actually teaching people about those materials and how to use them. So as you're thinking about what you've had in terms of support to learn how to use those aspects and those materials of your plan, you might kind of reflect and say, where do I need more support? Or where do I need more instruction on how to use these? Or you might be saying, I feel actually really confident in using all of these tools. Kudos to our school leaders. And if you find yourself in that latter category, it is really, really nice to hear things when you're like a school leader from the people that you're supporting, when they say, hey, like, you guys really set us up for success. Like, thank you for all the work that you've done and all the planning you've done. So if you can think of some compliments or nice things to pass up the chain to people that are leading this work in your school, that would be a really nice thing to share with them. Additionally, providing training on the plan and showing how to use those expectation lesson plans that you might have for teaching those school-wide expectations to all students. And also like just having some ongoing method for getting additional support for doing various aspects of your plan, like implementing school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. And so in terms of what that might look like, we're going to show you a preview of a material here in just a few minutes called the Universal Reinforcement System. That is like a really great example of what some weekly tips that might be passed on to your colleagues could look like. So just something to kind of keep in your back pocket and think about what have you had in terms of instruction on CI3T and what might you need more of? And we'll connect you with some resources that you could go out and find some of those supports if you need them. As far as procedures for teaching students, the really big thing is just making sure that everybody in the school is getting consistent instruction on those school-wide expectations to make sure that kids know what to do in the classroom, in the hallway, at the cafeteria, on the playground. And just like Julie was talking about, having opportunities to see examples and non-examples and actually engage in that learning by using role playing and having conversations about why those expectations are important and how they actually make people's lives better at school and how they make students feel safe and feel successful. Also, we're going to make sure that teachers, again, are displaying those posters. So it's not enough just to have the physical materials, but actually putting them up in the classroom where students can see them and on a regular basis, actually referencing those posters, like literally walking over to them, gesturing, getting students to attend to those posters. And by doing that, we're actually doing something that's really subtle, but really powerful, which is we're turning those posters into a visual cue so that every time students see the poster, they're immediately reminded of all the rules that they've been taught. And that way, suddenly they're moving towards being an independent learner or a self-regulated student because they have materials to remind them of those expectations, but they're not relying on adults to continually remind them of what to do. And one of the things we can do to do that is just to continually reference those posters and to incorporate that vocabulary into our daily classrooms. And then using the tickets, or we'll call them universal reinforcers, to intermittently reinforce students demonstrating expectations. So intermittently just means occasionally. So we're not giving tickets every time a student follows directions or shows respect. It's going to happen almost seemingly at random. And oftentimes we're going to be using higher rates of praise and tickets at the beginning of the school year, particularly as we're really pushing the instruction on those school-wide expectations, because those reinforcers, those are the tools that we're going to use to increase the probability that those behaviors will happen. We're going to dig a little bit more into that language about reinforcement and behavioral probabilities here in just a second, but just kind of put that on ice for just a moment. We'll return to that soon. And then also making sure that we're continually teaching those social skills. We've already had really good conversations about the importance of consistency across the school and just making sure people know how to teach those lessons really successfully. And then lastly, in terms of procedures for teaching, making sure that parents and community members are getting some instruction about what you all are trying to accomplish with CI3T and providing some supports to help parents understand, or families and parents understand, like, what are your school-wide expectations? How could that language be used in the home to kind of combine with all the conversations that are happening between both home and school environments to really help students make connections about how they can be respectful, responsible, and be a learner in both environments, or whatever your school-wide expectations may be. And then also just sharing some information about behavior screening and the ways that your school are collecting data to help figure out which students might need a little bit of extra support, because parents like to know that there's a plan in place if their student might be having difficulty in academics or behavior. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get referred for special ed, but rather your school has continual monitoring of how students are doing and plans that you can actually get connected to interventions at the first sign of concern. So sharing information like that can be really, really helpful for at least getting the ball rolling on parents understanding what this work is all about. And then Kathleen mentioned before, using our digital footprint to help communicate about CI3T is also really powerful. So if you have any like activity updates or big ideas that you'd want to share with parents, or even just like fun videos that would help convey some of the excitement that you have about your school-wide expectations or your social and emotional learning program, using your website or digital spaces is a really nice way to convey that information to families and community members as well. And if you've got ongoing things like PTO meetings or opportunities to interface with parent support groups or community organizations, again, taking advantage of those opportunities to kind of put a little bit of CI3T in those conversations as well is a great way to just tie everything together in terms of what's happening with your school community. So one of the big modules that we really are excited about for this year that just actually got revised over the summer is about this procedures for teaching component. And it's called embedding and integrating CI3T domains into daily instruction. And basically what it's all about is procedures for teaching students. So what this module is going to show is how to incorporate really good academic instruction, behavioral instruction and supports, and social and emotional learning all into a unified and integrated instructional environment in the classroom, and to do this on a daily basis, so that we're not siloing academic skills and behavioral skills, but rather meshing them all together so that every lesson that we plan for our students is incorporating the language, vocabularies, and objectives and skills of those social and emotional learning lessons and your behavioral expectations as well. And there are some really nice materials in this module, like videos that basically give examples for what integrated lesson planning looks like. And of course, our integrated lesson plan can be downloaded from this module as well. And also showing how those low intensity supports that Kathleen mentioned before, like active supervision, pre-correction, behavior specific praise, how those can be woven into instruction in a seamless way so that teachers aren't feeling like, oh, I got to do this, and then I have to do this and figure out how to, do 7 things at the same time, but it's rather like having a really strategic way to just be comfortable with those strategies and figure out how to just drip them into instruction and have them become like a second nature. So this module could be a great way for introducing a lot of those concepts and getting people comfortable with what that might look like in their classroom. And again, we also, if people are interested in going deep onto a specific low intensity strategy, we've got a behavior specific praise module and an instructional choice module that are available. And by the end, I think of this calendar year, we should have modules for each of the 7 low intensity supports as well. So if you're interested in going deep into one of those, or your colleagues might benefit from that kind of support, do keep in mind and look out for these purple cards that are on our enhanced website. That's where you can find those low intensity support modules. Okay, so we're going to shift to procedures for reinforcing now. So procedures for reinforcing is all about how we can acknowledge the behavior of different stakeholders, faculty and staff, students, parents, and community members. We want to acknowledge when people are doing behaviors that are supporting the plan or are aligned with the plan. So when we're thinking about faculty and staff, one of the things that we might think about is how can we actually acknowledge people for doing this work? We're asking teachers to change the way they teach in some cases. People are learning new skills. They're learning those low intensity supports. They're potentially moving away from different classroom management systems that they've kind of been personalizing in their own classroom in the past, and now moving towards a universal system that's going to go with the school-wide plan. And sometimes those changes can be a little bit hard to accomplish. They can feel a little bit scary. Sometimes people can be a little bit resistant. So what we want to do is think about how can we support people in making those shifts by seeing the efforts that they're making and acknowledging those efforts. One way we can do that is actually really similar to how we reinforce the behavior of students. Is we can praise those behaviors, we can acknowledge them in public or in private, and in some cases we can even connect those universal reinforcers that we give to students, those tickets. We can actually connect teachers to potential little minor rewards that they could access for giving those tickets to students. So some schools will do things like drawings for non-tangible opportunities. Like sometimes a member of the CI3T leadership team will come in and cover 10 minutes of recess duty so that teacher can have a 10-minute break. And how sweet would that be? I mean, we know that teachers really don't get much free time throughout the day. They get no free time throughout the day. It's hard to make it to the bathroom. So like a 10-minute reprieve from recess duty could be so meaningful and a great way to acknowledge people for doing their CI3T work. So there are probably some thoughts in terms of what your school is doing to reinforce faculty and staff. We would encourage you to actually go into your plan and look and see what those ideas are. Because you might notice like, oh, shoot, this year we haven't really done much to, or really haven't heard anything about how we're being acknowledged or we're being reinforced. And if you find that to be the case, you might actually mention that to your CI3T team and say, hey, remember last year or 2 years ago when we had opportunities to like do a raffle for us, for staff, for doing our CI3T work? Like that would be cool to bring that back. And oftentimes that can be a prompt that really kind of gets the ball rolling on that. So you might kind of look and see what's there and just kind of see like, is this happening right now? And if not, who can we talk to about getting that going? So then in terms of students, the main thing we think about with reinforcement is giving behavior specific praise and those tickets or universal reinforcers. And sometimes this can be an issue that people are a little bit resistant to those tickets, or they don't feel confident in using them, or sometimes they feel like they're not really working the way that they're supposed to work. And so in just a minute, we're actually going to go deep on that issue and talk about some materials that you have access to really take a deep dive in why those tickets work and how to make them work well in your school or class. And how those tickets are used is a really huge issue in terms of determining how effective they are. So that will be part of that conversation, is to talk about how can we make sure that the tickets can be used by students to access things or avoid things that would be reinforcing to them. And then lastly, how can we think about reinforcing parents and community members for their work? And oftentimes positive phone calls home or postcards, just like little things that sort of like jump out from the background of our lives. Like somebody sending a praise note home about something that their child did that day, like that has such positive potential to make the relationship stronger between school and home, and just to get parents excited about like, oh my gosh, my kid got like acknowledged out of all the kids in their class for helping their peers or for being an extra respectful learner today. Those are really, really nice ways that we can reinforce the support and the connections that parents and family members are making to school-wide expectations, for example. So that might be something that you think about as well. So now we're going to jump into a specific enhancing CI3T professional learning module that I've referenced a couple of times leading up to right now. It's called Universal Reinforcement System. And basically, if you were to go to the enhancing or the project enhance tab of our website and sign in, you would find a yellow card there that looks like this. It's got the title Universal Reinforcement System on it. And if you were to click the link, you would be asked to type your email address in. And once you're registered to access the module, it'll take you straight through to an ebook. And that ebook is basically going to give you all of the content that's associated with this module. If you prefer to kind of sit back and listen to the module, we also have an interactive resource. It's kind of like an abridged audiobook. It's a little bit shortened, but it's got all the infographics and templates and ideas. They're all captured there as well. So depending on your learning preferences, you could definitely access the ebook or interactive resource. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to preview that content in this presentation. It's not going to cover everything. So if you're wanting to go deeper into some of these topics, or if you're like, oh, he was talking too fast and I didn't quite capture that one idea, just know that this module is here for your reference, and definitely something that we encourage you to go back and take a look at as you're trying to learn about how to use this universal reinforcement system.
And Mark, I think we've got a little bit of time. If you're willing, would you mind pulling up the website just to show them how to get to that, just to put their email in? And you guys might have already found it if that doesn't throw you.
Yeah, I can do that. Hang on just 1 second.
We're going to do a little modeling.
Okay, so I'm going to go to ci3t.org. You guys can see my browser, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Google Chrome likes to take its time, so just
more time to love, right?
We could check out my fantasy football team in the meantime. I won't subject you to that. I think that's one of the big rules of social etiquette is you can't talk about your own fantasy football team. It's boring. Okay, Project Enhance. Okay, if you go to that tab, you are likely going to be asked to type in a password. My colleagues have put the password in the chat, and I'm sure we'll do so again. So if you're trying to access that, feel free to do that. On this website, you could scroll down just a little bit. If this is your first time on this page this year, what we would encourage you to do is to click on this link, which will give you an opportunity to register your school district email to access enhancing CI3T modules. When you register, it's going to ask you a few questions. It'll show you a quick informational letter that you can download for your records, and it's going to ask you to type in your email 2 or 3 times. The purpose is to make sure that we get an accurate accounting of your email address so that will serve as a sign-on for you to access modules in the future. Once you finish that registration process, it's going to spit you back to this website. You generally need to wait 2 to 5 minutes before you can actually access a module. This is just entirely too much information, but I'll share it with you anyways. What's happening is your email is being processed through a database on the back end of our system, and it just doesn't quite go in there in real time. So give it 2 to 5 minutes and your email gets added to a list. And once it's on the list, you'll be able to access any of these professional learning modules that you would like to check out. So my email is already on the list. So if I scroll down, I could find, let's see here, under the CI3T Building Your Base Knowledge section, we've got 3 modules that cover aspects of behavioral science and reinforcement. So we're going to be looking at the universal reinforcement system module, which I will just go ahead and open in a new tab. And there are also one module that I think is really cool and brand new is called understanding consequences in a CI3T model. So if you have people who are saying like, why are there no consequences in CI3T? Or like we're doing all this positive reinforcement, but like what do we do when kids act out? This module has some really helpful information to clarify both sort of the philosophical aspect of like what's punishment and like does punishment actually work? And if you're going to do punishment, what would that even look like in the classroom? So there's some information on that topic that we think is really helpful and clarifies some misunderstandings about reinforcement and punishment of those issues. So if that resonates with you, you might check out that module. But anyways, let's check out Universal Reinforcement System. I would click on this button. I'm going to type in my email address and go through. And it's going to let me continue to the module. And it's going to take me to this landing page, which is the ebook. And basically you can navigate the ebook by looking on the little toolbar in the left-hand side of your screen. It's got each section labeled here in this kind of gray text, and then you can kind of skip around as you like by clicking on the toolbar. I think we also have a nice little table of contents in the overview section that gives you a quick video overview of the module and actually shows you a nice visual table of contents of like every video, infographic, activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that shows up in this module. So if you find something here and you're like, ooh, I want this like practice simulation to share with somebody, you can actually just find a direct link to it right there.
And we put this together because some people in front of you that were looking at earlier drafts of this, they said things like, I wish there was a quick way where I could just like find all the infographics or all like they found a product that they like a simulation like Mark was showing you. And at the end of tonight, we'll show you this one other document that kind of gives you an overview. It's like a giant long document, but it's like this big guide that's what the contents is for every single module. So like if you wanted to download that, you could search it to see what things are there. So we'll show you that at the end of the night.
Yep. And while we're doing sort of show and tell, one of the things you'll find on the objectives page, which is like the landing page for this module, if you scroll down just a little bit, it says view the interactive resource that can be used as a standalone tool or in conjunction with the below text. Clicking that link is going to take me to, I'm going to mute it real quick. It looks like this. And basically it's like a PowerPoint that plays in your web browser. And if you were to turn the volume up,
implementing CI3T,
that would be me. And basically it's just voiced over PowerPoint presentation that's, it's kind of a dynamic illustration of the content. So basically, if you'd prefer to sit back and experience this in sort of a multimedia format instead of reading a book, this is definitely an option for you. And actually this material, this interactive resource, we've taken slides out of this and put them into our presentation tonight that shows you some of the content that's displayed here. So again, for you, if you're interested in learning more about this, we would encourage you to review these materials on your own and kind of use this as an opportunity to do some independent learning. And if you've got colleagues that are struggling with some of these issues as well, this would be an incredible resource to turn around and hand to them and say, hey, like, check this out. Like, I know you're struggling with this student. This module actually talks about how we can use our reinforcement system. We can just make a couple little tweaks and it might actually help the student's behavior in some specific ways. And
some people in some of our new partnerships, like the first year implementer, some of the new people, they're actually using this to actually teach parts of the plan. So they're downloading this and they're like showing it, like pushing play, like in a PLC or pushing play in a faculty meeting. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you showing them.
Yes. Yep, for sure. Okay. So I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint. I can find my presenter mode real quick. Okay, so again, these are actually slides that come out of that interactive resource, and I'll just kind of talk you through what you would hear if you were actually watching that on your own. So basically, what we explain in this module is that reinforcement is a fundamentally important aspect of the CI3T plan, and it sort of lies at the base of like the theoretical idea behind CI3T, which is to use something called applied behavior analysis, which is rooted in behavioral sciences, to figure out how do we actually change the behavior of potentially adults to change the behavior of students. And the idea being that by using reinforcement, we're increasing the probability that the behaviors we're teaching, which are good for students, we know that these behaviors are good for students because they're going to be more successful at school if they can use them, we want to increase the probability that those behaviors will take place. And reinforcement, as I'll tell you in just a second, is the mechanism by which we increase the odds that some behaviors will happen and hopefully decrease the odds that other behaviors will take place. So we really view this as sort of like a really core component of the model, but one that actually gets miscommunicated or misunderstood really frequently. So when we hear the word reinforcement, especially in education, it's super common for people immediately to think about like rewards and prizes. And we all fall prey to this. Like I think I said earlier, we can give adults rewards for implementing the plan. Rewards certainly can be a component of reinforcement, but we want to make sure that we don't use those as though they're the same thing. Because when we think about reinforcement as just giving a reward to someone, we're missing out on sort of the fundamental and scientific understanding of what does this actually mean. So in the module, we explain that reinforcement can be defined as the act of strengthening or encouraging something, or the state of being reinforced. And so when we think about, sometimes we'll hear people say, we don't think we should have to reinforce students for meeting expectations. They should just do it on their own, right? The issue then becomes, well, are we saying that we don't want to strengthen the behaviors that students need to be successful? Like, no one's going to really agree with that statement, right? So if we think about reinforcement from this very neutral perspective of like, do we want to strengthen successful behaviors? Yes, we would like to do that. That is sort of the essence of reinforcement. And there's also a more technical definition of reinforcement, which I'll get into in just a second, which is basically anything that makes a behavior more likely to occur is reinforcing that behavior. And we can reinforce good behaviors, and we can also reinforce less good behaviors. And oftentimes the choice is ours to figure out which behavior we're going to reinforce and what is actually reinforcing the behavior. So to go further into that idea, when we talk about reinforcement, we can actually just kind of shorten the word to reinforcer. A reinforcer is just something that gets added to a situation that makes a behavior more likely to occur in the future. So we give some examples in the ebook and interactive resource. For example, of like when you go to the grocery store, which line do you go to? Do you go to the self-checkout or do you go to the cashier? And if you ask yourself, why do you usually make that choice? You'll find that there's actually reinforcement that's acting on your behavior that's dictating that choice. So for example, if you go to the cashier because you like to have a little bit of social interaction or it's faster, those things are reinforcing that behavior. They're making it more likely for you to make that choice in the future. Whereas if you usually go to the self-checkout because maybe that's faster, or maybe you prefer to avoid, having to talk to the cashier. That's also reinforcing your behavior as well. And basically, we can see that this is a way we can think about even our own behaviors to understand that reinforcement is something that's kind of acting on us all the time. And so to dig into how this actually works, we think about reinforcement in two different ways. There is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And oftentimes, people usually understand positive reinforcement. We're adding something that makes a behavior more likely to occur. So the ticket is our classic example. We see the student engaging in expected behavior, we give them the ticket, and then they're more likely to engage in that expected behavior in the future. That's positive reinforcement. Now, negative reinforcement sometimes gets mischaracterized as punishment, when really negative reinforcement just means that we're taking away something that makes a behavior more likely to occur. So for example, if I go to the self-checkout because I'm avoiding the social attention of the cashier, I just want to get in, I want to get out, I don't want to have to talk to anybody. My behavior of making that choice is being negatively reinforced by my avoiding the social attention of that cashier. And so this is super helpful to think about, that negative reinforcement exists, because sometimes kids actually their behavior can be controlled by negative reinforcement because they really want to avoid certain things at school. Hey, Nettie, everybody's here tonight. Good to see you. So yeah, there are these two different dimensions of reinforcement that we want to think about. And while we're here, we can also think about punishment as well. A really neutral way to think about punishment is that something is introduced that makes a behavior less likely to occur. That's positive punishment. And negative punishment means we're taking something away that makes a behavior less likely to occur as well. We're not going to get way into punishment tonight because the emphasis is on reinforcement, but it is good to understand these four different dimensions of reinforcement and punishment because they do help us understand how the tickets can be used in a really effective way. The other thing we want to know is that when we're thinking about reinforcement, there are a couple of different categories that it helps to sort of identify like what are the different things that actually might change a behavior. So people can be reinforced by access to attention, right? Oftentimes the attention of peers is super reinforcing. Why do we make jokes? We make jokes because we make people laugh, and the laughter reinforces our joke telling behavior because we're getting attention from it. That's pretty obvious. Sometimes that we can be negatively reinforced through attention as well, because we want to avoid people's attention. So what behaviors do people do to avoid attention? They might do things like slow walk down the hall to get out of going to recess because they're anxious about having to, go play a game that they don't like, or having to go initiate peer interactions. So they're slow walking down the hallway. That might be negatively reinforced by avoiding peer attention. We can also think about accessing tangibles and activities. A lot of people are super motivated by getting the opportunity to get something that they like. I'm motivated by getting coffee. Like me making coffee in the morning gets me a tangible thing. Like I get a cup of coffee. Sometimes people are negatively reinforced by activities or tangibles. Kids that don't like math, they often act out during math because they want to get out of it, right? So we can be negatively reinforced there as well. And then there's the sensory category where people can be positively reinforced by gaining sensory experiences, like listening to music. But sometimes our behavior can be negatively reinforced by avoiding sensory experiences. Like if you ever notice that you have kids who get anxious in the lunchroom, for example, and they'll act out right before lunch because they're basically delaying going into the lunchroom, those kids' behaviors may be negatively reinforced by sensory experiences because they're trying to get out of those experiences. The reason this is all useful is that when we start thinking about how those tickets can be used, we want to make sure that there are opportunities for tickets to be exchanged into each of these categories. So not just getting tangibles, but potentially how can kids use tickets to avoid attention? Or how can kids use tickets to gain access to sensory experiences? Those are interesting questions to ask, and they're a little bit harder to actually answer. But having a variety of choices for using tickets is a really, really important feature of that system. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. So we've talked about what reinforcement is and some different ways that people can actually be reinforced. I can see most of you in my Zoom screen, so I'm going to just try to make this work. I'm going to give you a couple of pictures, and I want you to give me a thumbs up, or you can put yes in the chat or no in the chat if you think what we're looking at here is a potential, so maybe an example of reinforcement. So we've got a teacher giving a student a high five, presumably for giving the right answer. Is this an example of reinforcement, potentially? I see nods. Yeah, probably. Okay, cool. I see the principal's office, getting sent to the principal's office. Is that likely or possibly an example of reinforcement? I see some maybes. I see some head nods. Okay, maybe not.
I liked my principal. He had very big eyebrows. I always thought he, like a bird, could build a nest in those back in the day.
There you go. So, well, we'll come back to that. Maybe not the eyebrows part, but the liking the principal part. And then we've got our ticket. So getting a ticket, could that be an example of reinforcement? Yeah, probably. Okay. So there's no right or wrong answer to this, but I would say that each one of these three could be an example of reinforcement. So that makes sense for this guy and this guy, but why would going to the principal's office be an example of reinforcement? Well, the answer is if you like the principal, maybe you get in trouble so that you can go and visit the principal. And even if the principal is upset with you, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you don't actually mind getting some of that negative social attention because you just really like the principal. Or maybe you wanted to get out of reading and you acted out because you knew that you would get sent to the principal's office. Guess what? We're reinforcing the behaviors that cause them to be sent to the principal's office because they may have achieved the goal of escaping or being negatively reinforced from that behavior. So it bears in mind that basically reinforcement choices are all individualized. And so we need to think about these things on an individual basis. And often we just need to think about, did an action cause that behavior to be more likely to occur? If the kid keeps acting out when they get sent to the principal's office, we start to understand that we might be reinforcing that behavior. And we just need to rethink then our response to that behavior. So just kind of thinking outside of the box a little bit on reinforcement. So the question becomes, how can we use consequences to change behavior? And so this is a really important question. And as we move to the next slide, basically what we see is there's sort of a triangle of things we want to keep in mind. The first thing we want to do is we want to, of course, teach expectations. We want to make sure that kids know exactly what they're supposed to do to be successful in all the environments in the school, and that when students are meeting those expectations, they may, not they will, but they may receive a ticket from a teacher accompanied by behavior specific praise. And by using that ticket to access some sort of we'll call them a backup reinforcer or prize or reward potentially. Basically, that ticket is given some value as a tool for reinforcing, because the student knows that they can exchange it for something that will get them something they want, or for something potentially they want to avoid. So this is an example of a reinforcement menu that students can use Bobcat bucks to exchange for one of these options. And so again, as thinking about what those options might be, you'd like to diversify those options as much as possible to make sure that they're actually appealing to students and that they give people opportunities to access or avoid things that they might like or dislike. So one thing that people get a little bit hung up on is, especially recently, I've been seeing more conversations about this, is like, what is the evidence about using what is essentially a token economy, our universal reinforcement system, to support student behavior? There are some people who will cite, I'm going to say, research that says, "Oh, this is bad for kids. It's bribing kids. It's manipulating kids. It's coercive." A lot of that research is not terribly rigorous, and it's not really often research. It's more of people with PhDs who have opinions about these things and write books. When you actually look into literature on token economies, there is a really robust evidence base that suggests that they are pretty effective for supporting a variety of students. So for example, there's a recent meta-analysis that looked at token economies, and basically they found that from 1980 to 2014, there were quite a few studies that looked at both improvements in academic and behavioral skills related to interventions that use token economies. And they found a pretty strong and positive impact that those interventions were effective at improving in a positive direction student behavior. And they were equally effective at achieving academic and behavioral outcomes. And isn't that interesting that we can reinforce not just behavior, but academic behaviors that might improve achievement? So that suggests that what we can learn from the research on this topic is that it's probably worth doing and doing well because it's likely to produce a positive outcome for our students. In addition, the universal reinforcement system is a common component of PBIS. When you look at the evidence base for PBIS, there are some people out there who talk about a variety of things that are kind of wacky, but when you really look at the research, PBIS has an excellent and very robust research base that shows it's effective for producing a lot of positive outcomes, including reductions in suspensions, expulsions, improved organizational health and safety. And if you're interested in finding some of the actual research on this topic, there are some links in the slide that can also be found in the module that basically break down the really, really strong research base for PBIS, of which this reinforcement system is a strong part. So definitely when we look at the research, there's a lot of good reasons to invest in doing this well. So some of the benefits of using the universal reinforcement system is it's going to provide across the school a consistent system that all students' behavior can be reinforced in the same way, which basically means that not just classroom teachers can participate in this reinforcement. Everybody can. The lunch ladies can, the janitors can, the paraprofessionals can, the principal can. Teachers can reinforce kids from other teachers' classes. The music teacher can reinforce kids in the same way for every student that comes into their class. No longer do we need to find 55 different marble jars, clip charts, token economies here and there. It's just one consistent system throughout the school. However, in addition to being consistent, it's also very flexible because we can customize certain aspects of it for particular kids or contexts. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those flexibilities are. But this balance of consistency and flexibility is one of the primary strengths of this system. And so again, I mentioned that everyone's giving the same thing. That's what makes it consistent. We don't have different tickets for second grade and fifth grade. We don't have some classes doing dojo and some classes doing a paper ticket. As much as possible, if we can be as consistent with what is actually given, it just simplifies the procedure and makes sure that everyone in the school can do this in a consistent manner. The other thing that makes it consistent is that everyone is using the same expectations. So they're reinforcing students for doing the same things throughout the school. And by using behavior specific praise, we're basically creating these rule governed behaviors where we're showing kids like, hey, if you engage in these behaviors, good things happen. And that sinks in, especially when you think about kids from kindergarten to fifth grade. If you're doing this work through the course of an entire student's academic career at your elementary school, like it is incredible to think about the amount of times that they can be reinforced for engaging in one or two or maybe five different behaviors. That's going to have an impact. And so that consistency at the individual student level is super, super powerful. So let's talk about flexibility though, right? So we mentioned about how different people are reinforced by different things, and that actually might fundamentally change how we try to go about reinforcing students for meeting expectations. Because if we try to give, little trinkets and erasers and pencils to every child, and that's the only thing that we've got, for your kids that maybe are really motivated at getting out of work they don't like, that's probably not going to work very well. And so the beauty of this system is that we're not directly handing some pencil or eraser or tangible to students. We're giving them something that they can exchange for something that's meaningful to them. And so having a lot of flexibility or having a lot of variety in the options that students can use their tickets for is really fundamentally powerful. And so again, we can go back to, we call this the function matrix, but thinking about how we can align the different possible, I'm going to say rewards, but take that for a grain of salt, the different reward options across this function matrix. We're gaining access to attention, tangibles, or sensory experiences, or avoiding attention, tangibles, or sensory activities is a great way to break down and see if you've got all the diversity of options for using those tickets that you might want. So for example, if you're saying, we don't have a lot of things that kids can avoid certain activities, you could do something as simple as like having a homework pass coupon in your school store, or a coupon to have them just choose odds or evens on an assignment. Or even like avoiding the lunch line, going straight to the front of the line, they could have a little coupon. And the beauty of those things, like the cool thing about negative reinforcement is a lot of times nobody has to spend any money on these things, right? You don't need to spend money on a bunch of rewards if you're balancing out across all of these different function matrix categories. So definitely something to think about there. The other thing that we want to consider in terms of flexibility is that when you start thinking about individual kids who continue to struggle with behavior, a lot of times what's happening is that there's not enough reinforcement that's occurring, or the reinforcement isn't optimized to sort of change their behavior in the way that you're hoping. And again, when we say change behavior, we're not talking about manipulating children. We're talking about teaching them how to be successful at school and giving them the support and acknowledgement and attention that they need to actually show those behaviors. So what we do in this module is talk about three different ways that we can adjust the way that the universal reinforcement system is used to help individual students. So what we can do is we can change the rate of reinforcement, or how often a child is reinforced. That's kind of the obvious thing. Kids who struggle with behavior might need to have more opportunities to earn tickets. However, two other things that are a little bit less obvious are they might need actually different options for how they use reinforcers. Like some kids are very specific in what they're being reinforced for their challenging behavior. And when that's the case, we really want to make sure we're finding ways to give them opportunities to access the same kind of reinforcement by doing the right thing. So if you've got kids who are struggling to finish their math lessons every day because they just can't make it for 30 whole minutes through the math instruction, maybe we start giving reinforcements with the possibility of them shortening that math lesson by just a little bit, by escaping it for doing the right thing. And oftentimes people kind of struggle with this because you're saying, you want me to let them out of math early for good behavior, and temporarily, yes. But like if they never make it through math, if they can make it through 15 minutes of math on Monday and 20 minutes of math on Tuesday and 25 minutes of math by the end of 2 weeks, we're slowly increasing their behavior over time. And suddenly they're being successful where they were being unsuccessful before. Last thing is we can also change the frequency with which they can actually use their reinforcers. Kids that really struggle with behavior, if you only can use your tickets once a week or once a month, maybe that's not enough. Maybe they need to have an opportunity to shop a little bit more often. So if they have good options and they have more chances to shop, that can be a really great way to help them be more responsive to those behaviors. So I'm going to just kind of move a little bit quicker through this last piece here. Sometimes teachers will kind of struggle with the kids that struggle with behavior end up getting too many tickets. And that's kind of causing a problem in our school-wide store. And that can be the case, but remembering that sometimes those kids that get a lot of tickets might just need an individualized menu for reinforcement options. And having them use those tickets more often can kind of pull those tickets out of the school-wide system so that you're not having one kid like hoarding 200 tickets because they're having more opportunities to use them. And again, finding some maybe customized options for using those tickets is a really good way to do that as well. So just to really briefly summarize, the universal reinforcement system is a super powerful way that gives us consistency in our school and flexibility with supporting behavior that we can customize based on individual students' needs. And we'll wrap this section up by just showing you in the module, there are some do's and don'ts of behavior that kind of model like sometimes teachers do this, but instead we could try to do this. So for example, sometimes teachers get really enthusiastic about using the tickets and they'll do things like, oh, you got the right answer. I'm going to give you 2 tickets. What we really want to do is we want to give 1 ticket per behavior because we don't want to accidentally communicate that some behaviors are more valuable than others. And we'd really like to reinforce engagement and participation instead of achievement, because getting the right answer isn't necessarily directly under the student's control, but giving effort is absolutely under the student's control. We would like to focus on reinforcing effort. Another thing that sometimes will take place is students having a hard time following instructions or directions. And the teacher, in an effort to get the student back on track, will say, oh, if you can follow directions, I'll give you a ticket. This doesn't work very well because we're actually teaching the student that the best way to get an opportunity for a ticket is to act out first. So we don't want to say those words because we're kind of like dangling this reward in front of their face for actually showing challenging behavior. Instead, what we want to do is reconnect them to the expectations, remind them what they should be doing, and move on to someone else in the class that you can reinforce who is already meeting expectations, because we're communicating the best way to be reinforced is by doing the right thing. That's really important. And it kind of moves us out of this more coercive mentality and into one where we're celebrating kids who are being successful and reminding kids what they need to do to be successful when they're struggling. Last one, sometimes we get stuck in sort of this ultimatum pattern where it's like we're frustrated, understandably so, students really struggling, and we might say something like, oh, you can't earn tickets behaving that way. It's not really a very constructive way to approach the situation. So instead, what we want to do is use that 6-step instructional approach. We're going to show empathy, acknowledge kids who are already meeting expectations, and then hopefully circle back to that student at a later time when they can show that they can get back on track. And that's the opportunity then to provide that behavior-specific praise and a ticket. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to you all for a quick conversation about either reinforcement, which we just spent quite a bit of time on. So if you have any questions or comments about that part of the presentation, this is a great time for that. Or if you've got questions about procedures for teaching or professional learning opportunities, that is also definitely something that we can chat about. So I'll open the floor to you all for a quick, probably 6-minute conversation.
One thing that all of your schools will be doing, and I know some of you know this because you lead it, but your school will be in fall and spring giving every adult in the building the opportunity to give input on what they think about the goals of your CI3T plan and what it's looking like in terms of what the procedures for teaching are look like, how reinforcing's going. And I know that you've had rich sets of experiences that you'll be able to continue to share. And I love that you're still screening. And one of my most amazing moments at the beginning of the pandemic was when I logged into a call and first question out of her mouth was, how are we going to measure treatment integrity in remote instruction? Like I could have just reached out and hugged her, because those data are so important, because that's how we know if we are truly serving kids in this integrated way at tier 1 and doing so in a way that's also healthy for kids and teachers. So we want to make sure that this is coming. So you're going to get a chance to give specific input here. And then following that, we'll be checking in with you to find out how you're doing in terms of your well-being and what you think of these extra resources. You'll also continue to get to look at how your kids are doing in terms of internalizing and externalizing and reading and math. And know that when we come back in the days ahead, your teams will be continuing to look at this information, pulling it together to see what you're sharing, and all this information will be used not only to revise your CI3T implementation plan manual at the end of this year based on your treatment integrity and your social data, but we will also be looking at these sources of information for the next 2 years, and we will be revising all these modules that you see. And I'm excited about that, because as we wrap up tonight and move forward, we are so thankful for the opportunity to listen and learn from you. And when you come back the next time, if you choose to come back, these are like short versions of the title. The next time we'll be talking about systematic screening because your data will be coming back to you. And we'll be talking about how to use that to make like decisions about what's happening at tier 1 and like resources that you might like want to commit to at tier 1 as far as your own practices. Like maybe you want to get more intentional with behavior specific praise, and everything you shared tonight, like about rebooting, super cool, because like that's the beauty of the system you've built, is that you've got those structures ready to go. And so each of these sessions that are coming up on screening and low intensity supports and moving forward at tier 2 and tier 3, we're looking forward to paving this path forward together so that we can continue to grow. And as I mentioned, the big topic for next week is using your screening data. And we're going to do an overview of how that happens. And then each of the next sessions will be going deeper. So we'll move past just looking at tier 1 experiences and how to do that well. We'll also be looking at how to connect kids to supports, and we will continue to connect you back with those resources. So if you didn't have a chance tonight to log into that website and get into those modules, feel free to make a date on a Friday night with a good iced tea or something, and check those out. And you are also always welcome to drop into our monthly calls that are hosted by Grant Allen, who's on this call, University of Wisconsin at Stout. Some of you had the opportunity to work with him when he was a doc student. So next up, we will see you next month if you'd like to come back. So just please know that we're grateful. And if you want to bring other friends with you just from these schools, and then again, I just have to ask you nicely to not share beyond your current school, because we do have a randomized control trial taking place in South Carolina and the state of Washington. So we hope to see you again at our next session, and just thank you very much. And if you'd like to give us information on how we did tonight, we'd love to hear from you. And it's so great to see you guys so close to in person. And I cannot thank you enough individually and collectively. So thank you guys for being here, and we wish you a safe and wonderful evening. Take care.